with people who have done really important, groundbreaking work across their lives as scholars, and as researchers in all sorts of other forums. So I'm delighted today to welcome J.R. Carpenter and Sharon H. Venne, who are going to be in conversation about law and humanities and environmental rights and Indigenous rights. So I'm going to very briefly introduce JR, who is then going to take over to chair the event. So JR works at the Winchester School of Arts on a project on weather reports, wind as model, medium and experience. JR is a poet and scholar of international renown with books on clouds, on oceans, on wind, and on many other things. So thank you very much for being here. It's a privilege for the Institute to be hosting this event.
Thank you, Stephanie, and very warm thanks to the Southampton Institute of Arts and Humanities for enabling this event. And thank you to everyone in the room and online who's joined us. It's really my pleasure and my great privilege to invite Sharon H. Venne to speak with us today. I'll give a bit of context. Sharon and I met through the Eccles Center for American Studies at the British Library, and I want to acknowledge that that's part of how we're able to be here today. And we got to know each other when I was writer in residence at the University of Alberta 2 years ago. Sharon H. Venne is a Cree woman and lawyer from Treaty 6 territory, and also Blackfoot by marriage, a member of the Blood tribe in Treaty 7 territory. Does anybody in this room have any idea what I mean by treaty? Right. So part of what we want to do today is explain the interrelation between the treaties that have been agreed to between Indigenous peoples of what we know of as Canada, what I'll refer to as Turtle Island, and the Crown of England. And these treaties are land treaties, but they're much more than just land. They involve air, ocean, animals, plants, and people. And so it's important to understand this context of treaty in relation to what we're going to talk about today, which is more toward Sharon's work with environment. But Sharon started out and is still very much active as an Indigenous treaty rights lawyer. And very notably in the early 1980s, worked on a landmark case to have the numbered treaties that were signed, very much not signed, agreed between the Indigenous peoples of Turtle Island and the Queen Victoria at that time. Sharon fought a very influential case to have those treaties recognized as international treaties in the United Nations, which is to say that those treaties are still active treaties with the Crown of this country. Okay, so just to set the context for what we're talking about, to say that those that anybody here who's a British subject is implicated in these treaties. I want to stop talking and invite Sharon to clarify or correct me of how I may have mangled that, and talk to us a bit about that relationship between treaty and environment.
Hi. Nia notakwa Moscow Montokan. My name is Oldwoman Bear, sitting next to the creator, and I'm from the Thunderbird Bear clan. And I am by birth a Nehang. I'm Cree speaking. That's the language I'm speaking. And I have spent all my life working on these issues. 20 When I was about 5 years old, my father told me that he didn't know why he was alive. And he didn't know why I was alive. But we had a great responsibility to the creation. And that we had to always uphold that responsibility. So when I say I've been doing this most of my life, I more or less mean that. So I have worked on the issue of treaties because at the time in 1876, a treaty commissioner representing Queen Victoria came to our territory and asked our people to enter into a peace and friendship treaty to allow the Crown's subjects to live in peace and friendship in our territories. And our ancestors agreed to that. And we have always lived by that commitment made by our ancestors. Even though the government of Canada, who did not make the treaties with us, where the government of Canada has done a lot of terrible things to our people, we have never broken the treaty. We have always lived in peace and friendship. And for our side, we can say that. For the other side, we don't talk for them. They have to talk for themselves. But we point out quite often what that state of Canada has done and continues to do to our peoples. I'm sure people have recently heard about the unmarked graves that were found out by residential schools, because in the 1880s, the government took all the children aged 5 to 16 and put them in schools away from the people to break the nations. People weren't allowed to speak their language, practice our traditions. We weren't allowed, they cut our hair. We had to dress like Unia white people. And they did that from 1886 until 1979. Residential schools were in place. And if you didn't send your children to residential schools or allow them, you were not allowed to have food or anything. You couldn't leave the communities without a pass. There's a lot of things the government of Canada has done against our peoples, but we have never broken the treaty. And it's very important for people to understand that there's two parties to the treaty. There's the Crown, who asked to make a peace and friendship treaty with our people for her subjects to live in our territories, which we have agreed to. We never gave up our territories at the time of the treaty making. We've allowed them to live in our territories. And so that treaty still remains in place. So everybody who's a subject of the Crown is a direct and indirect beneficiary of that treaty. And we have always maintained, our old people, and I quite often tell, government people, you want to break the treaty? You want to end the treaties? That's fine with me. Go ahead. But then you have to leave our territory. You cannot live in our territories anymore. You'd have to vacate them, because we would go to the international community, decolonization committee, and ask to be decolonized. And all the people who are living in our territories would have to leave. So that's a legal, position that Canada finds itself in. So when you push them to that position, because quite often, government officials will tell me, well, Canada could just walk away from the treaties. I think, go ahead, walk away from them. But there's a consequence to that. And the consequence is this. Then they always backpedal and go, well, we're just hypothetically talking about it. We weren't really saying that we were going to do that. But, if we did, I go, yeah, well, go ahead. I'm not afraid. Go ahead, break them. I don't care. Because you say they're over and done with. Okay, fine. Live with the consequences. Because people think that, a lot of times I talk all over the world, like I've been everywhere. And a lot of people think that Canada is a good place. I was just telling JR at lunch, this singer, what's his name, Bono. He tries to, put himself out as a great activist and all this sort of stuff. Anyway, he said one day, I heard him saying, you know, what the world needs is another Canada. And I thought, oh no. That's the last thing the world needs is another Canada, because the world would be destroyed of what is going on in our territories now. And another one of the destruction would be really, really bad. So I don't think he knows what he's talking about. But we have to really look at these relationships that were entered into a long time ago and see them for what they are, because at the time the treaty was made, the treaty commissioner on behalf of the crown told our people that we could live as we've always lived, which means is that we are still responsible and have obligations to the creation. And that we take very seriously. And so we're always trying to protect our mother, who is the one that gives us life, and the one that provides sustenance to us. And we have to protect her. And I think everybody knows now that our mother is suffering. Everybody can see that. You don't have to be an Indigenous person to see that the earth is suffering. And there's great consequences to everybody of the earth suffers. We have a saying amongst our people. I'll translate it loosely for you. If all of the creation disappeared tomorrow, the human cannot survive. But if the human disappeared tomorrow, the creation would survive. So we always have to remember where we are in the circle. The human is only part of the circle. We are not the circle. So I often hear people talking and they put themselves at the center when they are not the center. So that's when the treaty was made. That's how we were thinking about it. And and the other side wanted to have peace in our territory because they knew they could never overpower us at that time. And so they asked for peace and friendship. So that's what they got. Peace and friendship. We're still friendly with them, despite everything.
Despite everything. Can you talk a little bit about that tricky business where the treaties are agreed with the Crown of England, and then this entity of Canada is formed, and these treaties are not treaties with Canada. So when you're saying Canada is doing all of these terrible things, what are the responsibilities of the Crown of this country to respect the treaties that they've made by intervening in what Canada is doing? I mean, we never see that.
Well, I don't know. You probably weren't even born. Most of the people in the room weren't born at the time in 1979, or even before then. But anyway, let's not go over that issue. But we ended up in court here in England when Canada was trying to get the Parliament in Westminster to give them independence in the early 1980s. And we're very concerned, our old people were very concerned about what was going to happen with the treaties that were made with the Crown. Because the last thing we wanted to see was that the Crown would shift the obligation from the Crown to the state of Canada. And we were not prepared to agree to that. And so we came to court here in England. And actually, it's quite a famous court case in relation to rights, not only of Indigenous peoples in Canada, but also other areas of the Commonwealth, like Australia and New Zealand and Tanzania and other places. But anyway, what the court said, Lord Denning said, was that these treaties were a source of rights and obligations, originally made by the Crown and right of Great Britain, but nonetheless by the Crown now in right of Canada. So we still have the Crown in Canada. So the Governor General, and we, quite often write letters to the Governor General, outlining things. We send copies to the Queen and to the King. We always get responses back, by the way, more than we ever got back from Canada. We send letters to the Prime Minister, he never sends back anything, but we got all kinds of letters from the Queen, that maybe now in the future, the King will send back letters to us, like we get a response, like, so it's not like it's a kind of like one-off thing, write a letter to the Queen and then you don't hear back. Actually, you do hear back more frequently than you do from the Prime Minister of Canada, which is just down the road in Ottawa and across the big water here to come here. But there's still that relationship. And every time somebody from the Crown comes, whether it's, one of the princes or even Princess Anne or Queen Elizabeth or Prince or her husband, they always made reference in our territory that they were in our territory. So there was a recognition of that, which is more than a lot of people who live in Canada now don't recognize that they're in our territories, although now it's becoming more of a common thing now to say they give land recognition, that they are in our territories as a recognition of that they are there. So it's common now, quite common now for people in institutions and other places to say.
It's become a very common thing in an event like this, if this was taking place in Canada, that there would be a land acknowledgement to say that we acknowledge that we're in another, that we're in such and such territory. That is also problematic. It can be a bit of lip service sometimes. There are people who are trying, it's a complicated thing. Because so I'm born in Canada. I was born in Mi'kmaqui, and when I was a kid, and until it seems like in the past 10 years, this has become more of a thing. But we weren't aware of these things, and we certainly weren't aware of the degree to which treaties, this question that you just mentioned, or this issue that you just mentioned about the right of Indigenous people to continue their way of life, to live as they've always done, and that including being protectors of the environment. And so if treaty violation is including, so for example, in Treaty 6, the treaty has a stipulation that the settlers have the right to use the land to the depth of a plow. And you see oil derricks within the city limits of Edmonton. So that treaty is in violation on so many levels. And it's a very slow process for most settler Canadians even to understand that they themselves are living within breach of a treaty. And what's interesting to me here, as a Canadian who's out now doubly subject of the Queen, a British citizen as well, King, whatever, the Crown, is that if people in Canada who are actually living in Indigenous territories aren't aware of it, I'm really not sure how much people here. I understand that not everybody in the room is a subject of the Crown, but most people in England that I've met don't understand that as a subject of the Crown, they also have an entanglement with these treaties. What I'm interested in is how much the Indigenous peoples, certainly in Ontario Island, but as you know, around the world, you've worked with people around the world, are on the forefront of environmental activism due to their strong connection with their territories, not just land. Can you talk a little bit about the work that you've done? I'm thinking particularly about I always mangled the name, the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Tribunal. There's some part of my mouth that can't say this. Climate crimes together.
I'm a judge on the Intergenerational Climate Crimes Court.
And can you tell us a little bit about what that initiative is and what it's doing?
Well, it's I wrote a piece some time ago, I can't remember when, about the effect of they asked, I think someone wrote me an email and said, can you write something about the climate changes and how it affects indigenous peoples? And I can't remember what the email was, something like that. And I thought, this is kind of narrow focus of affecting the human. And I thought, no, we have to think about it in a bigger context. So I wrote a piece about what happened with the beavers. These are little animals that build dams and stuff. But there's in northwestern Alberta, you can Google it. It says largest beaver dam in the world. And this beaver dam has been built over a period of 40 plus years, and they're still building it. And so I was asking one of our relatives, Venne, the Venne and Crees are different tribes, but I asked him, what are these beavers doing? And the funny thing is, his nation and his tribe, there's people like Nora Beaver and Mike Beaver and Peter Beaver, just different families with the last name Beaver. And he said, which beaver are you talking about? What do they do? I said, no, not the human beavers. I'm talking about the the real ones. He said, well, what are they doing? I said, yeah, what are they doing? And he says, holding back clean water for the rest of the creation. And if you look at where this beaver dam is, it's northwest of where the large tar sands developments are, where they extract huge amounts of water, fresh water, to clean the sand and to extract the oil. But the water then is contaminated and not useful to anything.
If I can just interrupt for 1 second, which I wouldn't normally do. The tar sands occupy a geographical area the size of England. Okay, they're massive. This is what the beavers are up against.
Yeah. So they've built this gigantic dam to hold back clean water. And my question was, what did the beavers know they forgot to tell the humans about? Because somewhere along the line we have failed them as a human. I'm talking about me as a Cree woman. They stopped communicating with us to tell us there's a problem, or we weren't listening to them. Something happened and we weren't listening to the beavers. And so they just went ahead and did what they need to do, which is to keep back clean water for all of the humans, or all of the creation. So I started writing the piece about that, and then I started talking about how this failure of the human has led to almost the extinction of the buffalo in our territories. Like, it would be my great grandparents who last seen a herd of buffalo, but we still do the ceremonies every year for the buffalo to come back to our territory, because they're interconnected to our relationship with the land, because when they travel on the land, when they roll in the ground, they make hollows in the ground where the water then collects when it rains or snows, and little animals like frogs and birds and other things use that water in order to survive. And with the buffalo gone, it affected not only the environment of that, but also all of the creation that's attached to the buffaloes roaming across the prairie. And this is more than 100 years since they were traveling in this territory, and the effect it had on the creation is unbelievable. So I wrote about that in this article, and I sent it off to them, and I figured that they'd probably take a read and they go, oh yeah, right, okay, fine. She's obviously out to lunch, didn't understand the question, and what does this have to do with humans and climate change? But lo and behold, they actually published it. And then I was invited to sit as a judge on the intergenerational climate crimes tribunal. And basically what we hear at the tribunal is cases where the human has dramatically interfered with the creation and how this has affected not only generations of the human, but also all the environmental, the animals, the birds, the little insects, everything is, the land has been destroyed, the water. So we hear those kind of cases where you have multiple generations of affected what humans have done to the nature, into the creation, and how that needs to be acknowledged and somehow try to repair it so that there can be a sustainable ability for people to still live in their territory. So that's what we hear is those kind of cases, and we write about it so that people can learn from that. And when they think about it, think about how the effect is on everything, rather than just limiting how it's going to work or how much money you can make from that. But can you ever have enough money to populate the species that have gone extinct? What's the price tag for that? And people think, well, they're gone. But the thing is that what job did that species have in relation to the whole of the creation? You don't know that. And so how can you replicate that? So that's the kind of things that we listen to, and people from the land, from that area, talking about the effect on them, on the creation, and also on themselves and the future generations. Like me, I've never seen in our territory the buffalo. I mean, we have buffaloes now that are living amongst us, but those are in a confined space, but not roaming like they used to roam. So those are the kinds of things that we talk about there.
And then those that's written up, and is that available online? Some of the
Well, they're supposed to be what do you call those? Uplifted? No, uploaded. I'm not computer generate. I'm not a computer person. They're supposed to be, yeah, there will be. And I think we're supposed to have some kind of public forum where we're supposed to release them. Because we had the hearings in October of 2021. And so we wrote them, like these are complicated things to write. They're being written over 4 different continents. So there's information going back and forth. So we actually finished them now. So they'll be made publicly available.
Okay, and there is information about the tribunal itself online for anybody that's interested in that. And I know it's not directly related, but at the same time, you're also working on rewriting the treaty of
Maastricht Treaty.
The Maastricht Treaty. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I'm terrible with names. It's a big failing.
Well, the Maastricht Treaty is a European Union treaty on human rights, on the rights of the human being. And now they've asked some people, and I'm one of the people they asked, to amend the treaty to include the rights of future generations. And what's going on now and the effect it has on future generations, which is a huge undertaking, because I spend most of my time trying to educate people about thinking about the 7th generation, which I grew up learning. I was born to think not about myself, but into the 7th generation, like what I'm doing today, how it's going to affect the 7th generation, which is what we have to think about when we're making decisions. And so trying to educate people who don't grow up in that mindset, what that really means, how it works, because people are sitting, these are they're international lawyers, which I am also an international lawyer, but they have a Western European view of rights, which is that you think about the human in this time and place rather than the human in relation to the future. And so we're trying to draft how would future rights look to today? And if you're thinking about the future, how would you draft something? That's what we're working on.
And you took objection to this human rights
Yeah.
term.
Yes. I think humans are, like the least important thing in the equation. I'm sorry if that offends anybody. But I strongly believe that we have to think outside of that Western European human rights construct of what law really is. And we have to look at law in a more inclusive framework, which is that you have to think of all of the creation and in relation to talking about rights.
So it has to become a treaty of rights, not a treaty of human rights.
Exactly.
And how's that going?
Well, some days, people get frustrated with me because I keep saying the same thing over. I don't change my tune. I'm not a person that changes my tune to fit the audience. So what you hear today is what I say tomorrow. It doesn't change. But what they want me to, I think what some of them would like me to do is say that some of their ideas are interesting and that maybe we could work with them. But I don't put it through my filter of that as a human being. I look at it, how is the creation going to think about what we're talking about? And so it's hard for them to understand sometimes what I'm talking about.
I heard you say in a lecture that I watched online that if you're saying something over and over again, it's because no one's heard you yet.
Yeah, so sometimes people say, well, we've already heard that. Well, do you understand what have you done anything about it yet? If I heard that, then why didn't you do something about it? So I'll keep repeating myself until somebody does something about it.
We were talking a little bit at lunch about resistance and this kind of this resistance of refusal. I hope all of you received an email about this with this document that Sharon wrote up, but it was part of a long discussion. Can you tell us a little bit about this? The sheer force of refusal that generated this document.
The United Nations in about 1987 or 88 made a decision to have a conference on development and the environment. And if you know the United Nations system, which I know the United Nations system because I've been working in and around it since the 1970s, one of the things that they have is like a big conference like this or like climate change, they have what they call prepcoms, preparatory meetings. And at prepcoms, they talk about the issues and you try to incorporate concepts into the document so that when the actual conference is taking place, the document is more or less 99.9% complete. So people, when they show up at the conference, really, you don't really have that much, I don't usually go to the end product because it's already been decided. And people should learn that, so prepcoms are really important. Anyway, so what happened was Canada managed to get this guy named Maurice Strom, who was the president of Hydro Ontario in Canada as the Secretary General or the president of this conference. And a group of us Indigenous peoples had gone and asked to be part of the preparatory meetings in relation to this big conference they were planning in Rio in 1992, which was incidentally 500 years of Columbus. But anyway, that's another issue. And he said no. He didn't think that Indigenous peoples had anything to offer in relation to the environment and environmental issues, which took us aback a bit. But anyway, he said no, we wouldn't be able to participate and as indigenous peoples, there was not going to be any accommodation of indigenous peoples, and thank you very much, for coming to see him, blah, blah, blah. So we left. And I was pretty ticked off about that because I thought, who's this guy to tell us this kind of thing? We don't have anything to do with the environment. What do you mean? It wasn't for us, you wouldn't have an environment. But anyway, so we had a meeting in Geneva. There's a few of us indigenous people from Southern Central America and North America. And we had a meeting in Geneva one day, and I said, basically, who the hell cares what Maurice Strom thinks about the conference? We have something to say as indigenous peoples. We should organize our own conference. And we did. We went around and we got some money. We figured out how to do that. So I had this big conference in Brazil before the Rio conference, and we had it at one of the indigenous villages outside of Rio at karaoke, and it was so they had like a huge meeting house, like a thatched meeting house, and everybody crawled underneath and sat inside. Very nice place. It's very, very air conditioned. No air conditioned, but naturally cool in the jungle. Anyway, we had this conference, but there was a lot of indigenous activists who were there from all over the place who did not want their faces or pictures or anything that they were there at the conference, because they had left their countries without the knowledge of the country that they were living inside of and traveled to this conference. And so they didn't want any kind of press inside the conference. And so they said they'd like to have the press excluded. We said, yeah, sure, why not? We don't care. We don't need the press. So anyway, so we excluded the press. We said, no press. But what it caused this humongous fury, like the press are going, what? We have a freedom of press. We have a right to be there. We need to be there. We said, no, we don't. This is an indigenous meeting. We don't want you. We don't need you, so go away. And it caused a huge ruckus. We were like front page news all over the world. Indigenous peoples plan in secret. And we're like, oh God. Anyway, so what we ended up doing is we said, okay, we will have at the end of each day a press briefing. And I was designated for the English speaking, and Marcus Torino was designated to do the Spanish and the Portuguese. So we were behind this big stockade at the village, right? They had this big, huge stockade, like to keep out wild animals, but also to keep out the press. But anyway, we climbed up on these big step ladders and, stood at the top and gave these press briefings. So all of a sudden we're front page news and all over the place. And all the newspapers in Brazil and all the newses were covering, about these indigenous meeting and karaoke. Next thing you know, we get a message from Maurice Strom. He wants us to go into Rio to meet with him about what our issues were. We don't have any issues. We have, this is like a really classic colonizer way of thinking. What's your issue? What's your problem? We said no. We went to you and you said no, so okay, fine, no is no, we understand that. So, we're not interested in coming to Rio to meet with you. We don't care. We'll put you up in hotels. We'll, blah, blah, blah. We don't know. We don't care. We're not going there. We're going to stay here. We're going to continue meeting. We got things to do. And lo and behold, he shows up. He comes out, he wants to meet with us. Okay, fine, we meet with him. And he says, well, whatever kind of statement you come out with at the end of the conference, could you come and, make a report at the conference? And I said, no, we're not. We're not making a report here. We're not giving you legitimacy. We're not doing that. And he said, what do you want? And I said, whatever we come out with, we wanted this part of the record. It has to be a document authorized under the General Assembly, because I understand the UN rules, okay? It has to be an A document under the General Assembly. It has to be a published document under the A. He said, I can't do that. I said, okay, fine, goodbye. Anyway, he left. And then we sent a message out the next day saying they would. And then he said I could read it into the record. And I said, no. I would not read it into the record because that's not my territory. And you have to respect the territory of the people that you are in. And the people that are there are people from the Amazon, from Brazil, from South and Central America. They have more right to speak at that conference than I do. And so I'm not going there to read it into whatever came out. But what happened was, unfortunately, is that quite often I'm the only Indigenous lawyer in the whole bloody meeting. So they said to me, since you're the lawyer here, you can draft the document for us. So I drafted this document for a people. So I'm just going to read you something. It says, we, the Indigenous peoples, walk to the future in the footprints of our ancestors. This is not my words. I mean, I wrote it down, but it's not me. This was David Yanomami from the Yanomami tribe, from the Amazon. And that's what he said in the meeting. And I thought it was such a powerful statement that he made that in that meeting. And if you read this document and you translate it into the Indigenous languages, there's absolutely no, you don't lose anything in the language. And so it says that it was signed at Karaoke, Brazil, on the 30th day of May, 1992, but it wasn't signed with a piece, like people putting a signature on it. What we did is we got an ink pad, you know, like an ink pad. I don't know if you still have those anymore, ink pads. And people came and put their thumbprint or their fingerprint on the document. And so it's a huge document, and people came, and some people had their children, and they put their children's feet in the ink pad and put their children's feet on this paper. That's how we did it. And if you read this, it's our view of our responsibility as to the future generations. That's how this document came into being. And it is a UN document. You can actually go into the United Nations website and you can find this document, because it is a designated it's designated in the UN system as it's a General Assembly document. So we had to, that's what we did, you know. And all along the way, you could see how they were trying to maneuver us, trying to manipulate us into agreeing to their agenda. But we had our own project and our own work that we needed to do, and we did it. So that's where karaoke came from.
I mean, I've had the pleasure of having many conversations with Sharon, and she could tell you many more stories of resistance and mayhem causing through a combination of knowing the law and sticking to the Indigenous reading of what Indigenous rights are. I want to open up to questions now. If anybody in the room has any questions, and if we have any questions coming from online, I'll start with the room. Does anybody in the room have any questions? We have one back here.
Thank you. First of all, thank you. This has been so great. I was wondering about the intergenerational climate crime tribunal.
It is hard to say.
And I was wondering, because you were talking about thinking about non-law of humans, non-rights of humans beyond humans. And I was wondering if there was any instances where the participation of the rest of creation was able to participate in the tribunal process. Was there a way for those kind of voices and participants to come into it?
You want to repeat the question for people online?
Yeah, exactly. You're reading my mind.
Oh.
So the question was about the intergenerational climate crime tribunal being more than human, and if there was any way for the more than human actors in this role, the stakeholders, to be present in the room. And I wondered if you might, to anticipate your answer a bit, I wonder if you might talk about the way the room was set up, and there were fossils and there were other elements going on in this room.
Yeah, well, it wasn't looking like a, what you would look like a room like this. It was a big square room, and there was pictures on the walls and all over the place of species that have gone extinct, so that we're always conscious of it. But also too, in the presentations, both, like we had people talking to the issues, but we also had video of like, we had pictures of, like, I'll just recount one, like where we had the issue of Mongolia, where the mining companies have depleted the water resources, and so the camels, which normally have these two big humps, and they were really small now because they were without water and they were basically dying. So they had pictures of them. And then we had, in India where they had where they a big US company was had allowed a mercury contamination, and we had fish and wildlife and land species of pictures of them shown to us. And so you could see it's not only humans that have been affected by it, but the fish and the animals and all these other. So we're always conscious of these pictures that were being shown to us, and it wasn't just a human part of it. There was more involved in that than that. So it always makes you aware of what happened, like when we saw where they did away with all of the forest in order to grow palm oil, and what it did to the animals and all this sort of stuff. So we had a lot of visuals, which, as I got to tell you, as a judge, at the end of the day, 8 hours of seeing these things, you really have a hard time to sleep, because they're sort of burned into your mind, and you start thinking about the horror of what you're looking at. And so it was very difficult to sleep. I found a week of non-sleeping makes you kind of discombobulated at the best of times, but this was really something.
Thank you for that. I think we might have some questions from online. Is that?
From this side of the room? Yes. Thank you. You say here. Do you want me to read? I can read from here. Or from here. We have many forums from which to read.
Go ahead.
Read questions from. So from our extensive online audience, we have a question in terms of intergenerational responsibilities to the past and the future. What are amongst the most pressing concerns you wish to flag up? And what strategies might you suggest to engage them? That's a really tiny question.
Well, I always, start out from looking at what exactly is, like, let me give you an example so that you can see this. Like, a lot of times people come into our territories, I'm talking about non-Indigenous peoples, coming into our territories, and they'll say, you should go ahead with this project, whether it be a dam, building a dam, deforestation, whatever they think is a good idea, building a nuclear plant, storage nuclear waste, whatever. And they'll come in and tell us that this is a good development model, or it's a good development project. We have to get with the times, whatever year it is, 2000, 2023, or whatever year, they'll, tell us this kind of thing. And our the collective response, and I go back to the old people, this is not something new to me. But I remember when I was quite young, I heard one of the old people asking the question, so What would happen if the trees got together and had a meeting? And they decided that, oh, we've been making oxygen for these people, for all these species, all these years, but geez, we don't want to do this anymore. We're going to develop and do something different. So we're not going to make oxygen anymore. And let's have a vote. And we're not going to do that anymore. What would happen? Because without oxygen, nothing survives. So that's how we have to sort of step outside ourselves and think, what is going on and why are we doing something? And quite often people, tell us whatever year it is. For us, it doesn't mean anything. Years don't mean nothing to us. So whatever year it is, it's just another year. But think about those beavers have been making this dam for intergenerations. Like it's been a number of generations that these beavers are building this dam, and they continue to build. They're still doing it. So how did they transmit that information from generation to generation? They're thinking about the future. Why aren't we? So that's how we kind of try to educate our young people, because there's a lot of pressure on our young people. People say, oh, it's whatever it is going on now, hip hop, whatever is going on, whatever, video games, whatever, that you should be thinking about something different. And we have to kind of drag them back and say, no, this is what you have to think about, your responsibility to the future. You have to come back to that. So that's how, that's what we try to go forward with that.
I think that strategy of decentering yourself and thinking more broadly is a really good. I hope everybody took that down as a note.
Well, the least important person in the room is the human. Sorry to tell you that, but that's the truth. I mean, for us, it is anyway.
I think we might have time for one more question. Does anybody else in the room or online? Yeah, Nina.
I was wondering how you personally approach implementing creative forms of law in more sterile settings. When you enter kind of a room which is more institutional, how do you approach storytelling?
So the question is around how to approach storytelling in more institutional settings. That makes sense. Does that represent your question?
Well, we live in a storytelling. I mean, I'm talking about my Indigenous world. We live in a storytelling environment. So I have a son, and his whole world has been evolving around stories that are told to him by myself or his father or his grandparents, his uncles, his aunts. So he learned by stories and responsibilities from the stories. So for us, it's a very important component of who we are. And we can't step away from that.
Absolutely. Do you think that's about all we have time for? Do we have one?
I think we have time maybe for
One more quick question.
Yes, I mean,
Do you have one?
I have many.
I feel like you have a question over there, Steph. What do you got for us?
Sort through which question I most eagerly want to ask. And it's great, Nina, that you brought up this question about the relationship between storytelling and the law. I was wondering, could you speak a little bit about how that's been important to your work with people and peoples from across the world? So I know you've done a lot of work with Australia and peoples in Australia, and how much of those correspondences have been about kind of, those hard legal discussions, And how much of them, how much has story and poetry and art been really important to those relationships and that gathering of international momentum around people's rights, environmental rights, and that refusal of that model of the individual human right? That was an overly elaborate question. I apologize. Let's try to get 2 million to one.
Well, I teach a class in Australia, in South Australia at Adelaide with another Aboriginal professor, law professor. We call it law from the edges. Because Indigenous law, whether it's from Turtle Island or from Australia or from Aotearoa or some other place in the Amazon or wherever, Indigenous law has some very basic similarities. It doesn't matter where you are on our mother. The responsibility to the creation is a core. And so it's really easy to talk about in amongst ourselves as Indigenous lawyers or Indigenous law keepers about law, because then there's some fundamental components that we all understand to be the law. And and so for us, it's an easy thing to do. That's how, and if you read the Karaoke Declaration, it's full of Indigenous laws. If you read the Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the original document from 1992, that's also full of Indigenous laws. I'm not talking about the one that was passed at the United Nations 2007, because that's a state document, but the original one was an Indigenous document, and that's full of Indigenous laws. And that was done in the collaboration of hundreds of Indigenous peoples from around the world. So, and using our legal systems to move it forward, because that original declaration was a declaration related to the rights of the collective over the individual, which is what was so unique in the UN system. And when it was first adopted by the UN system in '92, was the collective rights rather than the individual rights. So it was a big effort on behalf of Indigenous peoples all over the world to get that done. But
if I could tease out part of what I think Steph's question is like what, so is story, as you've just said, that's so central to your people, is that also part of the law? Like, is that part of the communicating of the law? Is you know what I'm getting at?
yeah, but you're using story in a different way that I would use story.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not the same concept. I think story for, well, I don't know what your concept is, but it's not some frivolous kind of discussion.
No, I don't think we mean frivolous kind of discussion, but I mean, and now I'm sort of extrapolating on what Steph means. I don't know if you want to clarify the sort of second part of your question, Steph.
I was thinking this idea of the law, international law or state law as this, kind of black letter law, as not capacious enough to capture the form of law that you're talking about, and there being kind of familiarity across Indigenous peoples and First Nation peoples across the world, and that seriousness of story. I suppose actually that's what I was trying to get at, the different forms. I suppose it's a question about form, and that bringing those different forms of law to that really kind of those strict, tightly bound ideas of law. So I was really fascinated by you talk that document that is now lodged at the UN and is official document, but clearly is in doing some work of negotiating between one way of articulating the law and these other ways. But I'm talking too much. But it's really about the seriousness, I suppose, of different ways of telling stories to, I suppose, sustaining and articulating the law. Yeah.
I think it's a long conversation, and I'm really aware that we're, as you say, using some terms in different ways, in different meanings, and I think we're a bit out of time, but I hope it's just the beginning of a conversation.
Can I just say
Oh,
one?
please.
Okay, you should read my book, Evolving International Law Regarding Indigenous Peoples,
Everybody?
because what we're saying as Indigenous peoples, international law is evolving to meet what we've always understood. And at home, I always tell our people that non-Indigenous people do not have laws. They have a lot of rules and regulations that if they don't like it, they change them. Whereas we have laws that we are not allowed to change. We have to live by them. And so when we have ceremonies, and when we have the ceremonies, like soon we're gonna have the spring ceremonies. Because as you know, when the 12 and 12, we'll have the spring ceremonies that we don't change. We can't all of a sudden decide, oh, that's not a very useful time to have ceremony. Let's just change that. The law says we have to do it at that time, so we do it. So our concept of law and with the non-Indigenous people's concept of law are totally different things.
I think that's a really useful distinction. Thank you.
And a great point to end on. Thank you very
Yeah,
much.
I do hope that it's the beginning of a conversation. Thank you for sharing this document with us, which I think you all may have a bit more context for reading now. And thank you so much for coming to speak to us and sharing your knowledge with us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for all the effort to get me here. So thank you very much for that, and thank you for coming out. I really have enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Thank
Hi,
you.
hi.